Okay, maybe I've just been corrupted by a lifetime of watching horror movies, but I can't be the only one who thinks the sound of children singing nursery rhymes is creepy and sort of whoo. Nursery rhymes, those innocent childhood poems. There couldn't possibly be anything horrific about those, right? Well, au contraire, mon ami. It turns out many, I dare say even most, of the most famous nursery rhymes actually have histories that might as well have come right out of our favorite genre. This might not be news to some of you, but I'd be remiss if I hosted a horror channel and didn't, at least once, spend some time discussing the real stories behind all these dark and twisted nursery rhymes. So let's get right to it. We're going to go through a lot of nursery rhymes, so hopefully your favorite is on my list. If it isn't, be sure to leave me a comment and let me know which twisted children's rhyme I might have forgotten. First up is Baa Baa Black Sheep. It goes like this. Baa Baa Black Sheep, have you any wool? Yes, sir, 3 bags full. 1 for the master, 1 for the dame, and 1 for the little boy who lives down the lane. It's a simple little single stanza rhyme, a common format for nursery rhymes because it's easy for young children to remember. And it certainly sounds pretty innocent, right? I mean, it's just about a sheep and some wool. Nothing could possibly be dark about that, surely. Well, there are plenty of ideas about its dark history. It's a bit difficult to trace the rhyme's original meaning authoritatively because it dates from around 1744 and, as we'll see with a lot of these nursery rhymes, it's difficult to trace its exact origin. One idea that's sprung up fairly recently is alleged racism or connection to the American slave trade because it contains the word black. I shouldn't have to tell you, but I will anyway, this is entirely unfounded. I suppose it's just a sign of our politically correct times, but this kind of pseudo-history kind of annoys me, particularly in light of the fact that the rhyme predates the founding of the United States, the slave trade was far more associated with cotton than with wool, there's no evidence that it was ever written with a connection in mind between black sheep and black people, and in fact that black wool from black sheep was actually prized because it could be spun into dark clothing without the need of expensive dyes. So let's put that annoying myth to bed once and for all. However, there's a more convincing, if not entirely conclusive, argument to be made that the poem has its origin in connection to the period's excessive taxation. Indeed, the British, specifically King Edward I, imposed a tax on wool exports beginning in the 13th century, which lasted for quite a long time. And the poem does make a certain sense in light of this interpretation. Under this tax, the crown, or master, would receive 1/3 of the profit from the wool, the church, or dame, another third, and the farmer, or the boy down the lane, would be left with only 1/3 of the fruits of his own labor. Indeed, a 1744 printing of the rhyme from Tommy Thumb's Pretty Songbook has a slightly different wording, giving 2 to the master, 1 to the dame, and none to the little boy who cries down the lane, providing an even darker view of how the taxing authorities treat the shepherd who actually raises the sheep and produces the wool. It's far from the darkest nursery rhyme we'll consider, but given that I tend to consider tax collectors more horrifying and evil than any monster horror writers have yet managed to conjure, it seemed like an apt place to start. Not that I'm trying to get too political on this channel, because I'm really not, but if we're completely fair, regardless of your political views, I can't think of much in this world scarier than the IRS. Next up is Goosey Goosey Gander, which I think is probably less well known, but is more convincingly connected to a rather dark bit of history. And in fact, has more overtly dark words in the poem itself. Here's how it goes. Goosey Goosey Gander whither shall I wander? Upstairs and downstairs, and in my lady's chamber. There I met an old man who wouldn't say his prayers. So I took him by his left leg and threw him down the stairs. Aside from the throwing down the stairs bit, it sounds childlike and innocent enough, especially that first line. But it turns out this is actually a rhyme about religious persecution under Henry VIII and his various successors. It's well known that until quite recently, the Catholics said their prayers in Latin. And personally, I think that's a tradition they should have maintained, though the traditional Tridentine or Latin Mass has become increasingly rare since Vatican II, and all but banned under Pope Francis. Regardless, at the time in question, the Catholics prayed in Latin. However, during the English Reformation, these Latin prayers were outlawed in favor of the English Book of Common Prayer, variations of which are still used by the Anglican Church to this day. So the old man who wouldn't say his prayers likely refers to a Catholic priest who would have refused to use the Book of Common Prayer, instead using his Latin prayers. But since this was an illegal action, it had to be carried out in secret. In fact, Catholic households around this time often built priest holes, secret places to hide itinerant priests from the crown's priest hunters. And the first part of the rhyme suddenly makes sense. The narrator is playing the role of a priest hunter, searching upstairs and downstairs for the hiding priest. Indeed, even the line about taking him by the left leg is a specific reference to anti-Catholic sentiment of the time. During the reign of Edward VI, the left leg was a slang term for a Catholic. It should be noted that an alternative interpretation has been presented, associating the word goose with British slang for sexual behavior. And admittedly, the line about the lady's chamber does make a certain degree of sense in this context, so it's hypothetically possible to take the nursery rhyme as dealing with such matters as prostitution and the spread of sexually transmitted illnesses. However, I find this argument far less convincing than the claim that it's about priest holes. On a related topic, we need to discuss Three Blind Mice. First published by Thomas Ravenscroft, and there's a horror name if I've ever heard one. Anyway, first published in 1609, the rhyme, modernized from the original version, goes like this. Three blind mice, see how they run, see how they run. They all ran after the farmer's wife, who cut off their tails with a carving knife. Did you ever see such a sight in your life as three blind mice? Honestly, the words themselves are enough to classify as mildly horrific. I mean, if I were a mouse, I'm pretty sure the thought of having my tail cut off with a carving knife would be an idea worthy of any horror movie. But there's a legend that the rhyme actually has a rather dark history connected with the same Catholic-Protestant conflicts we've been talking about. Supposedly, the farmer's wife is none other than Queen Mary I of England. Queen Mary is also known as Bloody Mary because of her often violent persecution of Protestants during her reign. Incidentally, she's one of several possible contenders for being the origin of the Bloody Mary myth in folklore and in party games. A particular incident of relevance to us occurred in the year 1555, when the so-called Oxford martyrs were burned at the stake for heresy during Queen Mary's persecution of Protestants. They were Church of England bishops Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. If we want to read the farmer's wife as Queen Mary, then these three might be contenders for the three blind mice, particularly if, as some Catholics choose to do, we read their blindness as a reference to their religious beliefs. However, this is probably just the stuff of legend and not actually the origin of the nursery rhyme. Ravenscroft's original words don't refer to harming the mice at all, and its publication in 1609 was long enough after the end of Queen Mary's reign that it hardly seems like a topical reference. While we're on the topic of Queen Mary I, we certainly need to address the popular rhyme, Mary, Mary, quite contrary. It goes, "Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells and cockle shells and pretty maids all in a row." That one seems just about as innocent as they come at the surface, but of course there are a variety of possible histories that have been proposed over the years. On the less horrific side, this Mary has been identified with the Virgin Mary. On the more horrific side, she's been identified with the very same Bloody Mary we discussed a moment ago. In that interpretation, the line, "How does your garden grow?" may have been a reference to Queen Mary's lack of heirs. If this is the correct interpretation, then the silver bells and cockle shells, so innocent sounding at first, may end up being a reference to implements of torture. Let's move on to "London Bridge is falling down," which goes, "London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady." This one is rather hard to pin down to a specific origin. Similar rhymes, which may be the direct or indirect origins of this one, occur all around the world and all through recorded history, with some even predating written records in England. So we're probably not going to solve the mystery here in a silly little YouTube video. But there are a couple of contenders which may be of interest to phobophiles. The most horrific has to do with child sacrifice, of all things. According to this legend, there was a superstition that a bridge would collapse if a human sacrifice weren't buried in the foundation. Therefore, the story goes, human children were indeed buried in the foundation of London Bridge. Some versions of the story even have them being buried alive, which seems a particularly horrific way to be sacrificed, even as human sacrifices go. Fortunately, no one has ever found human remains in the foundations of London Bridge, and the story appears to be a complete fabrication. Interestingly, though, some skeletons were discovered near London Bridge in 2007 during construction work for the London Dungeons tourist attraction. The workers unearthed several human skeletons, leading to more than a few ghost stories. However, these were not sacrifices buried in the London Bridge Foundation, but rather either remains from an old plague pit or the cemetery for Southwark Cathedral. Interestingly enough, London Bridge has seen more than its share of violence over the years. It was once used as a site for public executions, including those of William Wallace, Guy Fawkes, and more, whose heads would have been impaled at the Traitor's Gate. But none of that is probably the origin of the rhyme. Another theory suggests the rhyme is related to a Viking raid led by Olaf II that destroyed part or all of London Bridge sometime around the year 1000. An earlier rhyme referencing the attack has been suggested as the origin of our rhyme, though this has been widely discredited. Some even question whether the attack took place at all, though for my money it seems likely that the attack did take place, but was not the origin of the nursery rhyme. Some scholars have focused less on London Bridge itself and instead tried to identify the fair lady in the rhyme's final line. Contenders for her include the Virgin Mary, Matilda of Scotland, who was responsible for building several bridges, though not London Bridge itself, Eleanor of Provence, consort to Henry III, who was once attacked with eggs and stones at the bridge due to the king's unpopularity at the time, an unnamed member of the Lee family of Stoneleigh Park, a connection tied to the rather unlikely human sacrifice story, or the River Lee, a tributary of the Thames. None of these potential identifications seem all that likely. By far the likeliest origin for the story is simply that there have been periods in London Bridge's history in which, due to its age, it has been in rather horrid disrepair. Indeed, it's even been replaced a few times, with one version being dismantled and reconstructed in Lake Havasu in Arizona, leading to endless confusion and annoying trivia questions concerning the quote-unquote real location of London Bridge. If this is, as I suspect, the correct interpretation of the rhyme, then the fair lady referenced in the final line Could be any fair lady who might happen to be listening and needn't be any important character from history. Rockabye Baby is another one whose lyrics themselves seem horrifying enough on the surface to raise some questions as to why people consider it a song for children. In case you don't recall, here's how it goes. Rockabye baby in the treetop, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall, and down will come baby, cradle and all. Personally, I'm all in favor of teaching children songs about horrifying things from an early age, but I suspect some people have been given cause to wonder why we assume a good lullaby tells the story of a baby potentially dying in an accident. Different strokes for different folks, I suppose. But once again, there are different possible interpretations of the song's origins. Some think the baby represents the god Horus from Egyptian mythology. Others think it may have been written by an early European settler in North America who noticed Native American women rocked their infants in cradles suspended from tree branches. That interpretation actually seems by far the most direct, but it's not the one I've heard most frequently. The most common, though still uncertain, claim is that the song is an attempt to mock the bloodline of King James II and Mary of Modena. The story goes that their son was not actually their son, but secretly brought into their family in order to ensure a Catholic heir to the throne. If that is the case, the wind in the song may refer to the wind of Protestantism, and so we begin to see a pattern. Many of these stories, at least plausibly, have their origin in European conflicts between the Catholics and the Protestants in the couple of centuries following the Reformation. Let's take a break from religious conflict for a moment, though, and look at an easier one. Humpty Dumpty. Everyone knows this one, right? Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. One possible explanation I've heard is that it referred to a weapon used during the English Civil War. This massive piece of apparatus would be brought to the top of a wall from which it could be used to rain death and destruction down upon attacking troops. However, my preferred interpretation comes from the fact that Humpty Dumpty was the name of a drink consisting of brandy boiled with ale. Combined with the idea that Humpty Dumpty was also 18th century slang for a clumsy person, this suggests the rhyme references drunken clumsiness. Not the darkest thing in the world, though I suppose that might depend on just how drunk and clumsy we're talking about. And incidentally, the song never mentions an egg. Humpty's usual depiction as an anthropomorphic egg might have come from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, in which Alice encounters Humpty and describes him as looking like an egg, though she does not claim that he is one. A great one for the horror fans is Pop Goes the Weasel. It shows up in plenty of horror movies. Usually the tune is played by a jack-in-the-box, and when it reaches the final note, something truly horrific pops out. In fact, it's become so associated with jack-in-the-box toys that I think a lot of people have forgotten the words. The words themselves have gone through quite a number of revisions over the years, but the one I learned as a child goes like this. All around the mulberry bush, the monkey chased the weasel. The monkey stopped to pull up his sock. Pop goes the weasel. However, one American version I wasn't familiar with until much more recently includes as additional verses, Jimmy's got the whooping cough, and Timmy's got the measles. That's the way the story goes. Pop goes the weasel. I've no time to wait and sigh, no patience to wait till by and by. Kiss me quick, I'm off, goodbye. Pop goes the weasel. Which, of course, turns the rhyme into something far darker. However, these are more recent additions and not part of the rhyme's origin story, nor of its most common incarnations. A couple of interpretive notes are in order. The first is that the earliest versions of the song referenced a cobbler's bench rather than a mulberry bush. However, to beat around the mulberry bush was an idiom meaning to avoid a difficult subject. This does suggest some possible interpretations, but only of later revisions and not necessarily of the original rhyme. The most common and somewhat depressing I've heard is that pop was slang for the act of pawning an item, and weasel was Cockney rhyming slang for weasel and stoat, meaning coat. I've never been able to understand the Cockney rhyming slang, but that's what I've read. In this case, the rhyme may then tell the story of a poor man who has to pawn his coat for money. Of course, we have to talk about Jack and Jill. It goes, Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. I've heard 3 interesting interpretations for this one. The first is that Jack and Jill were teenagers who went up the hill for, shall we say, relations, after which Jack runs away, abandoning the now pregnant Jill. There's no real corroboration for this story, but it does put an interesting twist on the rhyme. Another possibility is that Jack and Jill are King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette of France, who were both beheaded during the French Revolution. That's certainly my kind of dark story, but unfortunately it turns out to be too good to be true. The French Revolution didn't take place until decades after the song first appeared. Finally, it's possible that the song references King Charles I and his attempt to raise taxes on liquid measures. A Jack and a Jill referred to an eighth and a quarter of a pint, respectively. When Parliament rejected the king's new tax, the king ordered the volume of a Jack to be reduced, while holding the tax constant. Then the volume of the Jill came tumbling after. I have no idea if that's the true origin of the rhyme, but personally I like any song that helps children to recognize that taxmen are evil and not to be trusted. And now we're coming down the home stretch. I have just 2 more nursery rhymes for you. Of those, the first is Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo. Of course, it goes like this. Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo. Catch a tiger by the toe. If he hollers, let him go. Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo. How could that possibly have a dark history? Well, mostly it doesn't. It's one of any number of counting out rhymes that began to appear in the English language around 1815, and it just happens to be the one that's survived until the present day. However, there was a period in which it passed through, if not horrific, then at least distasteful territory. You see, the tiger in the second line was a fairly recent addition, meant to replace a particular racial epithet which had gained prominence in the song in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Proving that there can be litigation over even something as simple as a children's rhyme, this was also the basis of a 2003 lawsuit known as Sawyer versus Southwest Airlines. A flight attendant working for Southwest had been using a modified version of the rhyme to tell passengers to sit down, using the lines, Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, please sit down, it's time to go, and pick a seat, it's time to go. The plaintiffs in the lawsuit were African American passengers who alleged both intentional and negligent infliction of emotional distress on account of the rhyme's racist history, even though the flight attendant did not use the version containing the racial epithet, and versions of the rhyme without that line predate the versions with it. The jury found in favor of Southwest Airlines, and the plaintiff's appeal was denied. I mention that one not because it has a particularly dark origin, but because I'd be remiss if I made a video about nursery rhymes without mentioning the one that was the subject of fairly recent litigation. That leaves us with just one left. Before we get that, let me take just a moment to remind you to like this video and share it and all of my videos with your family, friends, enemies, whoever you can think of. Do also be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss out on anything in the future. Such things help me a lot. But that brings us to the one we've all been waiting for, which is called either Ring Around the Rosie or Ring a Roses. The most common British version of the rhyme goes, Ring a roses, a pocket full of posies. At a shoe, we all fall down. The most common American version is similar, but just a little bit different. Ring around the Rosie, a pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. And of course, there are plenty of hybrids between the two. The version I seem to recall from my own youth, though I could be misremembering, has the ring a roses from the British version, but also the ashes from the American version. Regardless, the most common interpretation is that the song is a direct reference to either the Great Plague of London in 1665 and 1666, which killed around 100,000 people, or about a quarter of London's population, or to the bubonic plague in general, which during the Black Death Plague killed as many as 200 million people throughout Europe between 1346 and 1353. Let's break down this interpretation a little bit. The first line, consisting of either ring around the Rosie or a ring of roses, may refer to the rash caused by the bubonic plague, which is technically not actually a rash, but swollen inflamed lymph nodes, which may appear reddish in color. The pocket full of posies refers to the satchels or posies of herbs and flowers people carried during the plague, either as herbal remedies or to mask the smell of death and disease resulting from the plague. The third and fourth lines seem rather self-explanatory. The sneezing sounds in the British version seem to correspond perfectly with the respiratory effects of disease, whereas the ashes in the American version are thought to refer to cremation of bodies or even the burning of plague victims' houses to avoid spreading the disease. A less common variant attributes the ashes line to the blackening of skin which occurs in plague victims. And of course, we all fall down needs no further comment, as that's exactly what happened during these plagues. The death and disease interpretation of the rhyme has become so popular that the following parody version even appeared in 1949 in the aftermath of World War II. Ring a ring of geranium, a pocket full of uranium, Hiroshima, all fall down, which was published in a 1949 edition of The Observer, although I've been unable to track down the identity of its author. If any of you happen to know, be sure to leave me a note down in the comments, because I'd like to give credit where it's due. In fact, even if you don't know, leave me a comment anyway, because I always enjoy seeing what y'all have to say. But here's the problem. This story is probably too compelling to be true. Most scholars seem convinced that it's false. The fact-checking website Snopes, while not the unbiased repository of truth it likes to pretend to be, does make a fairly compelling, if ever so slightly overstated, case against the authenticity of the plague interpretation. Earlier versions of the rhyme don't seem to match the plague explanation, which itself didn't appear in print until the 20th century. So, no, the song probably isn't really about the plague, either the Black Death or the Great Plague of London. But you know what? I don't care. I'll be the first to champion the high-quality scholarship that calls that interpretation into question, but I'm also perfectly comfortable holding the plague interpretation in my own mind whenever I hear the song. It may not be the original meaning of the song, but whenever I hear it, I'm still thinking about disease and death. And really, that's all a guy could ask for. So, that's it. A handful of nursery rhymes with dark, twisted, or horrific histories. Do be sure to come back next time when I talk about something to do with horror. I never quite know which topic is going to be next. And be sure to check out the What's It below for links to all of my other spooky projects. And until next time, take care and stay scared.